Hi, I'm Seth Pringle. Welcome to the Claremont Lewis Museum of Art here in the historic train depot in downtown Claremont. We're excited to be presenting Vince Skelly's first solo museum exhibition titled Vince Skelly Conversation with Trees. We love how he has taken the wood from trees that have been damaged by local storms or wildfires and salvaged the wood, giving them new life in sculptural forms and functional objects. So we hope you enjoy the exhibition.
Hi, my name is Vince Skelly. I'm an artist living and working in Claremont, California. We're here at my show at the Claremont Lewis Museum of Art. It's called A Conversation with Trees. We're gonna walk around and talk about all the different pieces, how I collected them, some of my process, and get a more detailed look at some of the work. So most of the pieces in this show all came from the storm back in January 2022. And when that storm happened, I was driving around town with my chainsaw and my crane that hooks up to my truck. And I was clearing roads, clearing parks, sidewalks, and cutting sections at a time and lifting them up with my hand crank crane, putting them in my truck, and then taking them back to my home studio. And I started to stockpile a huge amount of logs, and I quickly realized it was more than I could really handle, and I had to stop at some point because there was just so many, which was a very sad problem, a very terrible thing to encounter. The other place where I get wood is through West Coast Arborists. They have a program called Street Tree Revival, and what they do is go around and they collect logs that have to come down for either drought, they're diseased, they're dying, for all good reasons. And they take all their logs and they bring them to a log yard in Ontario, where they get slabbed up and sold as dining table slabs, dimensional lumber. But in general, I like to collect wood from the street. Anytime I see an arborist taking down a tree, I'll flag them down and maybe give them $20 and see if they'll put a chunk in my truck. But other times when I'm working on commissions and things that call for something specific, I'll go down to the log yard and pick out something that fits the project that I'm working on. So this first piece here is called Old Friend, and it's made out of redwood. I collected it from the Botanic Gardens here in Claremont. I knew somebody who worked there, and after the storm they contacted me and said that they had too many trees that came down that they could handle, so they were opening it up to friends and artists to come in and help collect some of the wood. And I made a lot of stuff out of this one redwood tree, and that was all in a previous show. This was one of the leftover pieces I had. One of the kind of rarer pieces because it's more figurative than abstract sculpture. There's a facial feature with a nose and a mouth and an obvious body form. This was inspired by ancient figurines and tools from the megalithic era. I look to a lot of ancient tools and everyday household objects like cookingware and bowls and tools for inspiration for form. I like how that kind of stuff feels perfectly placed in our world today. I'd been visiting the Botanic Gardens since I was a toddler, and so that place is really special to me. And it's nice to see how it's changed over time and evolved. Yeah, this is one of the pieces that I got from there. There's still more of that wood, so hopefully I'll be making more sculptures from that same tree. So I left a lot of the texture on it, mostly from the chainsaw. I did a little bit of chisel work on it, but primarily this was all done on a chainsaw. So on the face, you see these circular marks. That was me coming in with the chainsaw, which the tip of the bar is circular. So carving out this area and letting that evidence of the tool and the handmade qualities show through. I think the interesting thing about honing in on one tool, like I do in my studio practice, is that you can really stretch the possibilities of it. I'm just starting to get familiar with all the different textures that you can get from this chainsaw. Morelia Void, this piece is made out of Brazilian pepper, and I remember the morning when I first met this tree, I woke up to the sound of chainsaws going on my street, and I ran outside to see what was going on. And sure enough, my neighbors were having this tree removed, which was damaged in the storm, and it was like half broken. And so a crew was coming down, and they put it in my truck, and I drove it straight to my studio, unloaded it there, and it sat for about 2 months before I started working on it. Sometimes it takes me a long time to start a piece, to really like break into it, because you're starting with typically, you know, a long cylindrical log with bark on it. And if you don't have an idea of what exactly you want to do, sometimes you just have to wait until that idea comes to you. And I know it's like kind of cheesy, but like it's totally true. Sometimes you just have to like stare at it long enough until it starts to speak to you, and the form kind of starts to reveal itself. And a lot of times that happens when the sunlight hits it, or there's shadows from buildings or other trees that get in the way, and it creates a line or something, similar to like when you put your hand over your eye to try to like crop something out. And I love when that happens, because it's just like you're walking by and then you might see the light cropping your piece, or cropping a log in a certain way, and that just like makes you, that's indicates the first cut. But this one, Morelia Void, it came from Morelia Street, where I live here in Claremont. I'd never worked with this wood before. It's a really dense, hard wood. It's obviously not native, and I wanted to create something megalithic, very, very minimal, something that you could interact with. And so, I mean, I like when there's, to putting this kind of texture down here, it to me always makes me want to go in and touch it and feel it, and I think that, you know, a lot of people do the same thing. There's this gouge texture from the hand tools. And so after I rough it out with the chainsaw, I'll go in and refine the form with some hand tools, like traditional carving tools like gouges and chisels. And I've just grown to really like this detail, and so I use it in a lot of my work, which is just this gouge texture. And in this case, it's a sort of a portal that goes all the way through the piece. I think that the portals are something that I include in my work often. I like that it kind of draws you in and makes you want to like interact with it. It's like a window, you know. It's fun to look through and kind of, you know, see how it crops things, you know, on the other side. And it's also nice when like light comes through it if it's near a window. It's just something, a fun feature that I like to add in the work. The base of it already had this very interesting, organic, kind of porous texture to it. All these holes, which I believe are bark inclusion. And it was a little rough, a little too rough for what I wanted, and so I added the gouge texture to create a uniform look and feel around it. So the next piece is the Lowell stool, and this piece came from Pitzer College, which came down in the storm. And I was helping a student with a project at the Outback at Pitzer, creating some benches along the path. And we used a couple of the fallen pine trees for that project. This one was part of that didn't make it into the benches, and so brought it back to my studio to finish it. It's a very meditative process to implement. It's like the chainsaw is a very quick, aggressive, loud tool. And when I switch gears and go to the hand tools, it allows me to really spend time on a piece and get to know it. And it's just a very meditative process because it's very repetitive. There's this sound and these chips flying and the smells coming up from the tree. I really love doing that. This wood is pretty unstable, meaning as it dries, it splits. And so there's a lot of cracks that formed in this. Sometimes I'll do these butterfly joints anytime I see them. They're difficult on a round surface like this. They're a lot easier and done in a more traditional way on the tops of like tables and things, and you know, when you're working on a flat surface. But this tree had a lot of sap in it, and so it was drying. As it was drying out in my studio, I kept kind of moving it because the ground was just like, anytime you lifted it up, it would get so sticky. The top here has this discoloration, which looks like mold or something, but it's from minerals in the soil that the tree was sort of drinking up as it was growing. And the center of that is the discoloration from I believe it's the sap in the heartwood. So this piece is called Inverted Arch, and it's a second growth redwood tree from Northern California. I was originally carving it as an arch, but oftentimes I'm carving these pieces upside down so that I can have access to different angles of the chunk of wood. And I got so familiar with it upside down in this form that I started to kind of see it more as an inverted arch or an upside down arch than an actual arch. And that's just a good example of how the process and working with this kind of material can inform the work. It always changes, and there's always a lot of improvising that happens throughout it. This has happened several times where I end up liking the piece more upside down than right side up, and I love when that surprise happens. This was originally intended to be in my garden at our house, and it still might be. I always loved going to different parks in Claremont where there's sculpture gardens or public art pieces that you can come up to and touch and walk around, and even as a kid play on as a playground. And so that's definitely been an influence for the stuff that I make, and I want to do more and more of that kind of work, especially in Claremont, with all these trees that came from the city. This piece is called the Mountain Stool. It came from Mountain Avenue here in Claremont, just south of Condit on the east side of the street. Again, another one of the storm-fallen trees. And my father-in-law was driving by and saw it down, and he called me up and asked me if I was interested in it. So we both went up there, and I'd never worked with southern magnolia before. It's definitely an urban wood, or some people call it backyard wood, because it's not typically trees you can go to the lumber yard and buy. There's some joinery on top, the butterfly joints like I had mentioned before. I've done a lot of these for commissions and things. It's an iconic design. It's a three-legged stool. It's a ubiquitous design. And my sort of take on it is not only carving it from a solid block, but adding this kind of featured leg down here that has this wavy feature to it, just to give the legs a little bit of variety. It was just an interesting color too, because since I'd never worked with it, I had no idea what it was going to look like. And you never really know until you put oil on it, or maybe you can splash some water on it or something to get an idea of the color. But this wood was bright white before I had oiled it. So putting on the oil, the whole color, all the grain and everything just started to pop, and it was really fun to see. So this is the Humpback chair. It's made out of redwood, and it's definitely an oversized chair. I've made a lot of these chairs in the past, and they're standard size chairs. And it's, at the end of the day, they're hard wood seats, and they're not that comfortable. So you can almost curl up on it or use the back as more of a backrest, and it becomes a lot more comfortable when you have more space to sort of get creative on how you sit on it. The shape here is something I've done once before, but with this grain in particular, it had these really tight circular rings that started to form at this part of the tree. And so I was really responding to that with these hump shapes here. And that's something I do in a lot of my work, is just respond to the grain as it's being revealed. A lot of times I don't know what the inside of the tree is going to look like until I'm cutting into it. So for example, there might be a big void or a rotted area that comes out, and then it becomes this sort of challenge, and I have to figure out how to, incorporate it into the rest of the form. This tree is probably 500, 600, 700 years old. That came down, I believe, in a fire, because there's soot still it's all hard from the oil now, but there's definitely burnt marks. This whole inside area in here has all been burned out and somewhat unstable, so you can see I patched it quite a bit with these butterfly joints. It's extremely heavy. You can count the rings and see how old it is, which is always fun to do, but it's pretty hard. You need like a little needle point and like a magnifying glass to get through it all sometimes. So all the small pieces here are scraps that fell off of larger sculptures that I was carving. It was never my intention to make small sculptures. Oftentimes a piece will fall off as I'm carving with the chainsaw. It's got an interesting shape to it, or there's a piece of the grain that's looking really nice, and I'll save them in a box, and so I have a stockpile of all these little scraps. And lately I've been making little maquettes and just smaller sculptures out of them. I think it just comes from this place in my childhood of loving like building blocks and like Legos and just stacking things and creating these cool like architectural forms. Like this one here, it could be a bench or some sort of brutalist architectural building. And the one over here to the left, this one came from the storm wood. But as I was working with the piece of wood, I noticed that like the weight it was really like carving like a hardwood. And that's when I realized I think it was part of a redwood burl, which is like a very like compressed part of the tree, where it's sort of like, there's a lot happening. The grain is really tight and kind of swirly and gives you these like really nice textures and colors to the grain. And it's often a lot denser in that part of the tree. You kind of see it here where it almost looks like iridescent. There's these like waves of color. It kind of looks shiny in some areas. And then again, on the next one, going back to this idea of building blocks, this one is clearly architectural. It almost looks like a Japanese temple or something. I wasn't trying to make something that looked like that. It was really just stacking up these elements and threading the pieces with like dowels and glue to hold it all together. And these last two pieces, this is a old growth redwood. It was actually a fence post from our backyard that was rotted out. And I clipped off the last 12 inches or so and created this kind of, this like bench-like saddle bean shape. And then the piece to the left is made of white oak from Oregon. The form is inspired by ancient figurines and ancient toys and tools.